Everything is connected. Nothing is random.
This man killed entire families, changed his name, moved across the country, and almost got away with it forever. In 1985, a hunter walked into the woods near Bear Brook State Park in Allenstown, New Hampshire. He was looking for deer. What he found instead was a rusted industrial barrel, half buried in leaves, about 200 liters in capacity. When authorities opened it, they discovered the remains of a woman and a young girl. Both had been dead for years. The bodies were so decomposed that identification seemed impossible. There were no missing persons reports that matched. No one came forward to claim them. The case went cold. 15 years later, in the year 2000, investigators returned to the same site. They wanted to search the area more thoroughly. 100 meters from where the first barrel was found, they discovered a second one. Inside were 2 more children, 4 victims total, all female, all unidentified. The medical examiner determined they had died from blunt force trauma, but who they were, who killed them, and why no one had reported them missing remained a complete mystery. 3,000 miles away, in Scotts Valley, California, a different story was unfolding. In 1986, a man who called himself Gordon Jensen lived in a mobile home park with a little girl he said was his daughter. Her name was Lisa. She was 5 years old. One day, Jensen told his neighbors he was going out to buy food. He asked if they could watch Lisa for a few hours. He never came back. When police investigated, they found that the girl had no birth certificate, no social security number, no medical records. She couldn't tell them her last name. She only knew that her father called her Lisa. The child was placed into the foster care system. She grew up, she built life, but the questions never left her. Who was her mother? Why had her father abandoned her with strangers? And who was Gordon Jensen really? Across the country, in Manchester, New Hampshire, another disappearance had occurred 5 years earlier. In 1981, a 23-year-old woman named Denise Bodin vanished along with her 6-month-old daughter and her boyfriend. The boyfriend went by the name Bob Evans. Denise's family never filed a missing persons report. They believed the couple had simply left town. Evans had debts. He was evasive about his past. The assumption was that they had run away to start over somewhere else. The house was left behind. No one heard from them again. Decades passed. In Richmond, California, in the year 2002, a 44-year-old chemist named Yoon-Sun Jun disappeared. Her boyfriend was a quiet, strange man who called himself Larry Vanner. When police searched his home, they found something unusual in the garage. More than 500 kilograms of cat litter. Buried beneath it, they found Yoon-Sun Jun's dismembered body. Vanner was arrested. He was evasive during questioning. He had no real identification. His fingerprints didn't match any civilian records, but he accepted responsibility for the murder. He was convicted and sent to prison. In 2010, he died there. At first, none of these cases seemed related.
Let's return to Manchester, New Hampshire in 1981. Denise Bodin was young. She had a 6-month-old daughter. She lived with a man her family knew only as Bob Evans. Evans was in his late 30s. He worked occasional jobs as an electrician. He was charming when he wanted to be, but there was something off about him. He never talked about his past. He had no photographs from his childhood, no family he stayed in touch with. When Denise's relatives asked questions, he changed the subject. Denise's family described her as a caring mother. She wasn't the type to abandon her responsibilities, but Evans had a way of isolating her. He suggested they move away, start fresh, leave the deaths behind. Denise's family assumed that's what happened. They thought she had made a choice, a bad choice maybe, but a choice. So they didn't call the police, they didn't file a report, they waited. And as the months turned into years, the waiting became acceptance. Denise was gone, her daughter was gone, Bob Evans was gone. What investigators did not recognize at the time was that this pattern of disappearance, this quiet vanishing of a young mother and child, was not an isolated incident. It was a method. In the late 1970s, a woman named Marlise Honeychurch lived in California with her 2 daughters. She was in her 20s. She was looking for stability. Somewhere around 1978, she met a man. He seemed dependable. He had work. He paid attention to her children. According to later investigations, Marlise and her daughters disappeared sometime around that period. No missing persons report was ever filed. Her family lost contact. They assumed she had moved, that she was living her life somewhere else. This is where the first case intersects with the barrels in Bear Brook. In 1985, when that hunter found the first barrel in the woods of Allenstown, New Hampshire, the remains inside were those of an adult woman and a child. 15 years later, in 2000, when the second barrel was discovered, it contained 2 more children. Authorities worked for years to identify them. They used forensic reconstruction. They released composite sketches. They reached out to missing persons databases across the country. Nothing matched. The 4 victims became known simply as the Allenstown 4. Investigators determined that all 4 had died from blunt force trauma. The bodies had been placed in the barrels shortly after death. The barrels had been left in the woods, hidden but not deeply buried. Whoever did this wanted them gone, but not gone enough to take extra precautions. It was as if the killer believed no one would ever look for these people. And for a long time, that belief was correct. No one did, because no one knew they were missing. The forensic evidence suggested the murders had occurred sometime in the early 1980s, but without names, without identities, the case remained frozen.
Now we move to the other side of the country, Scotts Valley, California. A man calling himself Gordon Jensen lived in a trailer park. He was quiet. He kept to himself. He had a young daughter. At least that's what everyone assumed. The girl was 5 years old. She called him Dad. Her name, he said, was Lisa. Neighbors described Jensen as odd but not threatening. He worked intermittently. He didn't socialize much. He seemed devoted to the little girl in his way, but there was something strange about their relationship. The child was unusually quiet. She didn't attend a school. She didn't play with other children. When Jensen announced he was going out for food one afternoon and asked the neighbors to watch her, they thought nothing of it. Hours passed, then a full day, then another. Jensen never returned. The neighbors called the police. When authorities tried to locate Gordon Jensen, they found that the name was fake. There was no record of him, no social security number, no birth certificate for Lisa. The little girl couldn't provide much information. She knew her first name, she knew her father's face, but she didn't know where she came from. She didn't know her mother's name. She had no memory of any other family. She was placed into foster care and eventually adopted. The case of the abandoned girl generated some local attention, but it faded quickly. Without a crime beyond abandonment, without a clear victim to advocate for justice, the story disappeared from the news. Lisa grew up. She had a life, but the questions remained. Who was her mother? Why had her father left her? And who was Gordon Jensen? These questions would not be answered for 30 years, because at the time, no one connected Gordon Jensen to Bob Evans. No one connected either of them to the barrels in New Hampshire. The technology didn't exist yet. The databases weren't linked, and the man himself had moved on. By the late 1990s, he was living in California under another name, Larry Vanner. He worked odd jobs. He kept a low profile. In the early 2000s, he began a relationship with Yoon Soon Jun. Yoon Soon was 44 years old. She was a chemist. She was intelligent, independent, and cautious. But Vanner had a way of presenting himself as harmless. He was older now, in his 50s. He seemed quiet, maybe a little strange, but not dangerous. In 2002, Yoon Jun disappeared. Her colleagues reported her missing. Police interviewed Larry Vanner. He was evasive. His answers didn't add up. When investigators searched his home, they found the cat litter in the garage, hundreds of kilograms of it. Beneath it, they found Yoon-soon's body. She had been dismembered. Vanner was arrested. During questioning, he refused to provide real identification. His fingerprints didn't match any existing records in the civilian database. He was a ghost. But he accepted responsibility for Yoon Jun's murder. He was convicted and sentenced to prison. In 2010, Larry Vanner died there. The case was closed, or so it seemed.
For years, these cases existed in separate files, in separate states, handled by separate agencies. The barrels in New Hampshire remained unidentified. Lisa, the abandoned girl in California, had built a life, but still wondered about her origins. Denise Bowden's family had long accepted that she had chosen to disappear, and Larry Vanner was dead. But advances in DNA technology began to change everything. In the mid-2010s, genetic genealogy became a tool for law enforcement. Investigators could take DNA from unidentified remains and compare it not just to criminal databases, but to public genealogy websites. They could build family trees. They could trace ancestry. They could, for the first time, give names to the nameless. In 2016, investigators decided to use this technology on Lisa, the girl who had been abandoned in California 30 years earlier. She had always believed that Gordon Jensen was her biological father. The DNA test revealed otherwise. Gordon Jensen was not related to her at all. The test went further. It compared her DNA to missing persons cases across the country, and it found a match. Lisa was the daughter of Denise Bowden, the woman who had disappeared from Manchester, New Hampshire in 1981. This discovery reframed everything. Denise Bowden had not run away with Bob Evans. Evidence now suggested she had been killed. Her body was never found, but her daughter had been taken. Bob Evans had abducted the 6-month-old infant, traveled 3,000 miles across the country, and raised her under a false identity for 5 years. Then he abandoned her. He left her with strangers and disappeared. The realization was staggering. Larry Vanner and Gordon Jensen were the same person. But who was he really? Investigators turned their attention to Larry Vanner, the man who had died in prison in 2010. They had his DNA on file from the Yoon Jun murder case. They ran it through the new genealogical databases. They built a family tree, and they discovered his real name, Terry Peter Rasmussen. He was born in 1943 in Colorado. He had a wife and children in the 1960s and 70s. He had left them, he had drifted, and at some point he had started using other people's identities. But the genealogical work didn't stop there. Investigators compared Rasmussen's DNA to the remains found in the barrels in Bear Brook. The results were chilling. Terry Rasmussen was the biological father of one of the children found in the second barrel, the middle child. The other 3 victims were not related to him. Further testing and investigation led authorities to believe the adult woman in the first barrel was Marlise Honeychurch, the woman who had disappeared from California in the late 1970s with her 2 daughters. The 2 children in the first barrel were believed to be Marlise's daughters. The child in the second barrel, Rasmussen's biological daughter, was born sometime after he met Marlise.
Let's reconstruct what investigators believe happened. Sometime in the late 1970s, Terry Rasmussen met Marlise Honeychurch in California. She was a single mother with 2 young daughters.
He presented himself as stable, as dependable. He convinced her to trust him. They had a child together, a daughter, Rasmussen's biological daughter. Then, for reasons that remain unclear, he killed all four of them, Marlies, her two daughters, and his own child. He placed their bodies in barrels. He transported the barrels to New Hampshire. He left them in the woods near Bear Brook State Park. Then he stayed in the area. He didn't flee immediately. He remained in New Hampshire. He began a relationship with another woman, Denise Baudin. This was in 1981. Denise had a 6-month-old daughter. Rasmussen, now calling himself Bob Evans, moved in with them. The pattern repeated. He isolated Denise from her family. He created a narrative that they were leaving town, that they had debts, that they needed to disappear. And then, investigators believe, he killed her. Her body has never been found. But this time, he didn't kill the child. He took Denise's daughter. He left New Hampshire. He traveled across the country to California. He changed his name again, Gordon Jensen. For 5 years, Rasmussen lived in that trailer park in Scotts Valley, raising a child who was not his, a child whose mother he had likely murdered. Why he kept her alive is unknown. Why he eventually abandoned her is also unknown. But in 1986, he walked away. He left her with strangers, and he vanished again. For 16 years, he lived under other identities. He worked, he moved, he blended in, until 2002, when he killed Yoon-soon Jun. This time, he made mistakes. The body was found. He was caught. He was arrested as Larry Vanner. Even in custody, Rasmussen revealed nothing. He didn't confess to the other murders. He didn't explain the false names. He didn't tell investigators about the barrels. He accepted his sentence for Yoon-soon Jun's murder and said nothing else. In 2010, he died in prison. He took his secrets with him, or so he believed. What he couldn't have anticipated was the evolution of forensic science, the rise of genetic genealogy, the determination of investigators who refused to let the unidentified remain nameless.
There's a question that emerges from this case, and it's not about the murders themselves. It's about the silence. Why did no one notice? How did Terry Rasmussen move through decades, through multiple states, through multiple identities without being caught? The answer is uncomfortable. He targeted women who were vulnerable, women who were isolated, women whose disappearances could be explained away. Marlies Honeychurch had distanced herself from her family. When she stopped calling, they assumed she had moved on. Denise Baudin's relatives believed she had run away with Bob Evans. They thought it was her choice. Yoon-soon Jun lived alone. Her disappearance was noticed quickly, but only because she had colleagues who cared enough to report it. Rasmussen understood something fundamental about how people disappear. If no one files a report, there's no investigation. If there's no investigation, there's no search. If there's no search, there's no discovery. But there's another layer to this. The failure wasn't just social, it was systemic. In the 1980s and 90s, law enforcement agencies operated in silos. A missing person in New Hampshire wasn't automatically cross-referenced with unidentified remains in the same state. A child abandoned in California wasn't linked to a disappearance on the East Coast. Fingerprints from a murder suspect in one state weren't routinely compared with evidence from cold cases in another. The infrastructure didn't exist. Terry Rasmussen exploited these gaps. He understood that if he changed his name and moved to a different state, he was essentially starting over. There was no national database that could track him, no facial recognition, no genetic genealogy. He could become Bob Evans in New Hampshire, then Gordon Jensen in California, then Larry Vanner back in California, and no one would connect them, because they were different people in different places in different times. Except they weren't. They were all him. The files show something else. Rasmussen was skilled at creating plausible stories. When he moved in with Denise Baudin, he told her family he had financial troubles, that they needed to leave town.
It was a story that made sense. People run from debt. People start over. When he lived with Lisa in California, he told neighbors he was a single father, that the girl's mother had left. Again, a story that made sense. Single fathers exist, mothers leave. When he killed Yoon Soon Jun, he didn't run. He stayed in the house. He buried her body under cat litter in his own garage. It was brazen, but it was also calculated. He knew that if he acted normally, if he didn't flee, suspicion might not fall on him immediately, and it almost worked. He was only caught because Yoon Soon's colleagues pushed for an investigation. These weren't the actions of someone who was panicking. They were the actions of someone who had done this before, someone who had refined his approach over decades.
After Rasmussen's true identity was revealed, investigators began searching for other possible victims. They combed through missing persons reports from the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. They looked for patterns: women with children, disappearances that were never reported, cases where someone had simply moved away and lost contact with their families. So far, no additional confirmed victims have been identified, but the question remains: how many other women did Terry Rasmussen encounter? How many other children? There are gaps in his timeline, periods of months or years where his whereabouts are unknown. He drifted, he worked under the table, he avoided official records. This was a man who lived in the margins deliberately. He knew how to stay invisible, and invisibility for someone like him was freedom. The case of Lisa, the abandoned girl, raises another disturbing question. Why did he keep her alive? He had killed his own biological daughter. He had likely killed Denise Boudin, but he took Denise's infant daughter, raised her for 5 years, and then left her unharmed. Investigators have speculated, but there is no definitive answer. Some believe he kept her as a form of cover. A single man moving across the country might raise questions. A single father with a young daughter is more sympathetic, more believable. Others suggest he may have felt some attachment to the child, that there was something in him, however small, that prevented him from killing her. But the truth is, we don't know. Rasmussen never explained, and Lisa herself has said publicly that she doesn't want to speculate on his motives. She survived. That's what matters to her. The identification of the Bear Brook victims brought some closure. Marlise Honeychurch's family finally knew what had happened to her. They finally had a place to mourn. But there's still one victim who remains unidentified: the middle child, Terry Rasmussen's biological daughter. Her mother is unknown. Her name is unknown. Investigators have tried to trace Rasmussen's movements, to find records of women he may have been involved with, but so far, nothing has led to an identification. She remains nameless. In 2019, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children released a new facial reconstruction of the child. They distributed it widely, hoping someone, somewhere, might recognize her. So far, no one has come forward. It's possible her mother is also deceased. It's possible she was another woman Rasmussen isolated, another person whose disappearance went unreported. Or it's possible she's still alive, unaware that the child she may have lost decades ago is connected to one of the most disturbing serial murder cases in modern American history. There's a broader implication here. The Bear Brook case, as it's now known, exposed how fragile our systems were, how easy it was, not that long ago, for someone to simply become someone else, to erase their past, to move through society without accountability. Genetic genealogy has changed that. It's become a powerful tool for solving cold cases, for identifying remains, for connecting crimes that occurred decades apart. But it's also raised questions about privacy, about consent, about who has access to our genetic information and how it's used. These are important questions, but in the context of the Bear Brook case, genetic genealogy gave names back to people who'd been reduced to numbers.
It gave families answers. It connected dots that had remained scattered for 40 years. And it revealed the scope of Terry Rasmussen's crimes. Without it, he would have remained Larry Vanner, a man who killed once. The Barrels would have remained unidentified. Lisa would never have known her real mother's name. The investigation also highlighted how far law enforcement has come in terms of collaboration. The Bear Brook case involved agencies from multiple states. It involved forensic genealogists, cold case detectives, and victim advocates. It required databases to be linked, information to be shared, persistence across decades. This kind of coordination wasn't possible in the 1980s, but it's standard now, and it's because of cases like this. Still, there's something deeply unsettling about the timeline. Terry Rasmussen killed Marlise Honeychurch and the 3 children sometime in the early 1980s. He placed them in barrels and left them in the woods. Then he stayed in the same area. He began a relationship with Denise Bodin. He lived for a time just miles from where the bodies were hidden. This wasn't a man who killed in a panic and fled. This was someone who could compartmentalize, who could live a normal life, or a semblance of one, with the knowledge of what he had done. When the first barrel was discovered in 1985, Rasmussen was likely still in New Hampshire. He may have heard about it on the news. He would have known that the remains inside were the people he had killed. And yet, he didn't leave immediately. He stayed with Denise. He continued his life as Bob Evans. It wasn't until later that he took Denise's daughter and moved to California. This level of control is rare. Most killers distance themselves from their crimes. They want separation, physical, psychological, both. But Rasmussen seemed comfortable with proximity.
There's one more detail that stands out. When Rasmussen was arrested as Larry Vanner in 2002, his fingerprints didn't match any civilian records. But they should have. He had a past. He had been married. He had worked legitimate jobs earlier in his life. There should have been some trace of him. The fact that there wasn't suggests he had been intentional about erasing himself, about staying off the grid. Some investigators believe he may have used the identities of real people, men who had died, men whose social security numbers were still active, but whose deaths hadn't been properly recorded in all systems. This was a known tactic among people trying to disappear in the 1970s and 80s. It's much harder now, but back then it was possible. You could go to a graveyard, find the headstone of someone who had died young, request a copy of their birth certificate, and build a new identity from there. Whether Rasmussen did this, or whether Bob Evans, Gordon Jensen, and Larry Vanner were entirely fabricated names, remains unclear. What is clear is that he put effort into being untraceable. He avoided official documentation whenever possible. He worked jobs that paid in cash. He moved frequently. He never stayed in one place long enough for people to start asking too many questions. This wasn't improvisation. This was a system, and he followed it for decades. The families of the victims have spoken publicly about the impact of this case. For Denise Bodin's family, there's grief, but also guilt. They believed she had left willingly. They didn't search for her. They didn't push authorities to investigate. For 35 years, they thought she had made a choice. Learning the truth, that she had likely been killed and that her daughter had been abducted, reshaped everything they had believed about those years. For Lisa, now an adult with her own family, the revelation was both devastating and clarifying. She had always known something was wrong, that Gordon Jensen wasn't who he claimed to be, that her life before age 5 was a blank space she couldn't access. Learning that she was Denise Bodin's daughter gave her an identity, a history. But it also meant confronting the fact that the man who raised her, however briefly, was responsible for her mother's death. She has said in interviews that she doesn't remember much from those years, that the mind protects itself by forgetting. But she remembers the feeling of being alone, of not quite belonging. Marlise Honeychurch's family had a different kind of pain. They had lost contact with her in the late 1970s. They assumed she was living her life somewhere, that she had chosen distance. When they learned she had been murdered, that her daughters had been murdered, and that their remains had been sitting in barrels for decades, the grief was compounded by the lost time, the years they could have been searching,
the closure they could have had sooner.
The legacy of Terry Rasmussen, not just the murders, not just the identities, but the decades of absences, the families left waiting, the victims left nameless. He understood that the greatest weapon he had wasn't violence, it was invisibility. If no one knows you exist, no one can catch you. If no one reports a person missing, no one searches for them. If no one connects the cases, the pattern remains hidden. He almost succeeded. He died in prison believing he had. He never confessed to the Bear Brook murders. He never acknowledged Denise Beaudin. He never explained why he abandoned Lisa. He gave investigators nothing. He maintained his silence, his final act of control, until the end. But science caught up. Genetic genealogy unraveled what he had spent a lifetime concealing, and the truth, delayed by decades, finally emerged. The Bear Brook case is now used as a teaching tool in forensic science programs. It's studied by cold case units across the country. It's referenced in discussions about missing persons protocols and how to identify patterns across jurisdictions. It's become a case study in what happens when someone is determined to disappear and what it takes to find them anyway. But beyond the forensic techniques and the investigative breakthroughs, there's a human story here. 4 people in Marls, a young woman who vanished with her child, a little girl abandoned in a trailer park, a chemist murdered in her own home. These were real people. They have lives, families, futures. Terry Rasmussen took all of that, and then he tried to erase the fact that he had done so. In the end, he failed. Not because he made a dramatic mistake, not because he confessed, but because the people who loved his victims never stopped asking questions, because investigators refused to let the unidentified remain nameless, because technology advanced to a point where anonymity became almost impossible. The barrels were found in 1985 and 2000, but it took until 2017 for Rasmussen to be conclusively linked to them. 32 years for the first connection. That's a long time, but it happened. There's a detail that investigators have mentioned in interviews. When they finally identified Rasmussen and began piecing together his movements, they realized he had lived at various times in places where other unsolved disappearances had occurred. Women who had gone missing, women with children, women who, like Marlise and Denise, had simply lost contact with their families. None of these cases have been definitively linked to him. The evidence isn't there, but the proximity is troubling. It raises the question, how many times did he do this? How many other barrels might be out there undiscovered? How many other women believed they had found someone stable, someone safe, only to vanish?
There's no way to know. Rasmussen is dead. He left no journal, no confession, no map. The only evidence is what investigators can find, and after 40 years, evidence degrades, memories fade, witnesses die, the window for answers closes. But the work continues. There are still investigators looking into Rasmussen's past, still genealogists trying to identify the middle child from the Bear Brook barrels, still people searching databases, comparing notes, hoping for a connection. The case also raises a larger question about who gets remembered. The Bear Brook victims were nameless for decades. They were described by forensic markers: age, height, dental work. They were Victim 1, Victim 2, Victim 3, Victim 4. They were the Allenstown 4. It wasn't until they were identified that they became people again. Marlise, Marie, Sarah, and the middle child, whose name we still don't know. This is what happens when someone disappears without a trace. They become a case number, a file in a cold case unit, a sketch on a bulletin board. They lose their individuality. Their humanity gets reduced to evidence. And that's what Rasmussen was counting on, that the people he killed would remain nameless, that their families wouldn't know where to look, that the systems designed to protect and identify the missing would fail. For a long time, they did. But something changed. The rise of genetic genealogy, the determination of investigators who refused to let these cases fade.
the willingness of families to submit their DNA to public databases in the hope of finding lost relatives. These things, combined, made the impossible possible. They gave names back to the nameless. They connected cases that had seemed unconnected. They revealed the scope of Terry Rasmussen's crimes, and they did it years after his death. He thought he had won. He died believing his secrets were safe, but he was wrong. In 2019, New Hampshire authorities held a press conference. They announced the identities of 3 of the 4 Bear Brook victims. They showed photographs. They told the stories of Marlise Honeychurch and her daughters. They acknowledged the decades it had taken to reach this point, and they made a promise that they would not stop until the middle child was identified, that every victim deserves a name, that every family deserves answers. It's a promise they're still working to keep. There's something quietly devastating about walking through the woods near Bear Brook State Park today. It's a peaceful place. Trees, trails, the sound of birds. Families hike there. People camp. It's beautiful. But somewhere in those woods, 2 barrels sat hidden for years. Inside them, 4 people who had been reduced to objects, discarded, forgotten, until they weren't.
The case of Terry Rasmussen is not a mystery anymore. We know who he was, we know what he did, we know the names of most of his victims. But it's still unsolved in the ways that matter most. We don't know where Denise Beaudine's body is. We don't know the name of the middle child. We don't know if there were others. And we'll never know why. Why he killed. Why he kept Lisa alive. Why he stayed near the barrows. Why he lived the way he did, in shadows, under false names, always moving. Rasmussen took those answers with him. What we're left with is the aftermath. Families trying to rebuild around a truth that reshaped their past. Investigators still searching for the last pieces of the puzzle. And a case that serves as a reminder that people can disappear, that someone can live among us unnoticed for decades, that the systems we trust to protect us are not infallible, that sometimes the only thing standing between a nameless victim and justice is time, technology, and the refusal to forget. The Bear Brook case changed how law enforcement approaches unidentified remains. It changed how missing persons cases are tracked. It demonstrated the power of genetic genealogy and the importance of cross-jurisdictional communication. But it also exposed how much we still don't know. How many people are missing right now, presumed to have left willingly? How many unidentified remains are sitting in evidence rooms, waiting for a name? How many families are still waiting for answers that may never come? These questions don't have easy answers, but they're worth asking. In the end, this is a story about absence. The absence of identity, the absence of accountability, the absence of closure for so many years. Terry Rasmussen understood absence. He used it as a tool. He created voids where people used to be, and then he walked away. But absence, it turns out, leaves traces, genetic traces, investigative traces, the traces of people who refuse to stop looking. And those traces eventually led back to him. There's a photograph of Denise Beaudine that her family shared with investigators. She's smiling, she looks young, hopeful, she's holding her infant daughter. It's a moment of ordinary happiness, the kind of moment that happens every day to millions of people and means nothing except to those in the photograph. Except this moment is now evidence. This photograph is part of a case file. This smiling woman is a victim, and the baby in her arms grew up not knowing who her mother was. That's what Terry Rasmussen did. He turned ordinary lives into evidence. He turned people into mysteries, and then he disappeared. But not forever. Never forever. The work continues. Investigators are still searching for Denise Beaudine's remains. Genealogists are still trying to identify the middle child. Families are still processing what they've learned. And somewhere, someone might be reading about this case and realizing that a relative they lost contact with decades ago might be connected to it. That's the hope anyway, that someone, somewhere, will recognize a name, a face, a detail, that the last pieces of this puzzle will fall into place, that every victim will have a name, that every family will have answers,
It's been 40 years since the first murders, but the case is not closed. Not yet. Not until everyone is accounted for. Not until the silence is broken completely. And even then, the questions will remain. The ones without answers. The ones Terry Rasmussen took with him. The ones we'll never stop asking.